Welcome back to the Permissionless podcast, as always brought to you by the team at Guardian. And of course, we're going deep with DeFi builders. We're getting to know what are the deepest problems that keep them up at night, what are the hardest problems to break through, and also what does it feel like to have great success in the space? And perhaps most interestingly, where do they see the DeFi space and the Web3 industry going over the next handful of years? And today we got to have a wonderful conversation with the team at Tokemak, and we got to dive into their Autopools and really what it means to build the UX of a really sustainable product in crypto and be able to attract users with a powerful offer. And then we got to dive into a little bit of what makes building in DeFi hard and what is it that really takes to build and start to scale a DeFi team, and where's Web3 going over the next handful of years, some of the market trends that the Tokemak team is seeing now and how they are capitalizing on these at the moment. But of course, before we get into all of that in just a few seconds, my name is Owen and I'm a co-founder here at Guardian. We've been doing security reviews in the Web3 blockchain DeFi space for almost 4 years at this point. And really, we set out based on the premise that DeFi would encapsulate the global financial system, and many teams and institutions would be building and shipping with billions, tens of billions, or perhaps even hundreds of billions of dollars at risk, and that the security solutions available on the market were simply not up to par to be able to ship consistently and confidently in that environment. And today I'm happy to share that at Guardian, we have reached the standard necessary to consistently, confidently ship with a multi-phased approach to our audits. We use an initial phase where we have not just one, but multiple teams reviewing and verifying code and performing a typical audit. But this is followed up with a complete other phase where we have a public bounty contest that is paid for by the team at Guardian to ensure that nothing's been missed. And even if there are issues that have been missed in the first phase of the audit, we have this second public bounty contest phase to catch anything as a last barrier before moving on to production. And to date, the Guardian team has secured over $10 billion. And so at this point, really, it's just a matter of time for DeFi to catch up. And now, without further ado, let us dive into this episode with the Tokemak team.
Awesome. Well, Carson, Manuel, thanks so much for hopping on the podcast. Really excited, to get to learn more about you guys and everything you're building with Tokemak. But yeah, welcome.
Thanks for having us, Brandon.
Thank you, Brandon.
Yeah, so I guess to start things off, would love to learn more about, both your backgrounds in the space, kind of how you found about crypto and DeFi and the kind of the journey into it.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So I've been in the space since 2017, 2018. My original background is technology. Did a PhD in physics, came from an engineering background. Following kind of academia, worked a number of years at McKinsey, mostly in the banking, fintech, financial services space. And there kind of saw a lot of the things that work well in traditional finance and a lot of things that don't work well in traditional finance. Beginning of 2018, I left McKinsey to pursue full-time opportunities in crypto. I started on the market making prop trading side, which really was a precursor to what we've built and are building at Tokemak. But that opportunity, I really saw a lot of the issues in the space, the challenges and the fragmentation of liquidity that exists not only in DeFi, but also in CeFi. And so from that, as we get into it, that led to the need to build Tokemak. And along the way, also have built Membrane, which is really improving the lending ecosystem across credit, margin management, and even booking of loans and marketplaces in the space.
On my side, I have a background in electrical and computer engineering, and I got introduced to the space by one of my best friends, who's a real OG in the space, PD Dev. And eventually, when I left college, I went straight to an investment fund exclusively focused in crypto and later on DeFi. And then in 2022, I believe, I joined Carson at Tokemak, and now we're building Autopilot.
Awesome. Yeah, so really interesting backgrounds. I think what would be really interesting to get into, maybe on your side, Carson, is the signs that you saw. You mentioned, liquidity provision is broken, not only in DeFi, but also CeFi. And maybe, how some of those learnings kind of helped inspire what you're building at Tokemak.
Yeah, so I think the space has evolved a lot, obviously, since I started in 2018. When I first started, it was predominantly CeFi based. But then kind of in the 2019, 2020 timeframe, even pre-Uniswap, there's some really interesting things happening predominantly on in the Ethereum ecosystem. So 0x and various protocols that were experimenting with new models of decentralized marketplaces and liquidities were beginning to take off. As we kind of watched that develop and then eventually develop into the Uniswap and SushiSwap and AMM model, we saw that things improved in some ways, but some things got actually more challenging. So I would say the advent of AMMs let individuals sort of be LPs, which in the past was something very challenging. You needed a whole tech stack and very technical team in order to be a liquidity provider or market maker in order book models. But then with these AMMs, you now had a very well, you simplified some things. There was all this disparate ecosystem with multiple venues out there, multiple dexes, and it meant that there was this very manual process for individuals. And as incentives and various trading fees and yield possibilities began to arrive across the LP space, it meant that it was very challenging to keep up to speed on all these things, not only for new things launching, but also just where the trading volumes were. So it became a very laborious process in order to be kind of an LP that is trying to maximize their returns.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess it's a good, segue into maybe what Tokemak is, how you founded it, and also, how it's evolved over time.
Yeah, so in the very early days, and I think some of this still is in place today with the launch of our Autopilot platform, we were seeing sort of the move from a Web 2 model into Web 3, where data is being replaced with tokens. And in a tokenized world, our thesis was and is that liquidity is effectively bandwidth in that ecosystem. And so we built the first version of Tokemak really to manage kind of a decentralized LPing or decentralized market maker that could manage all of that liquidity bandwidth sort of across the space. At that point, we started with governance tokens. There was obviously a ton of liquidity and opportunities in governance tokens in that time period. And then as the space went through its, let's call it learning curve and difficulties over the years, we decided, hey, we need to build something with a much larger addressable market that is less volatile than just supporting governance tokens, and something that solves a solution or something that gives a solution for two different users. On the one side, LPs, and then on the other side, the actual issuers of these assets, whether stablecoins, various ETH, LSTs, et cetera. And that's really how Autopilot was born. And we'll get into it shortly kind of on what it actually does. But the core thesis still remains that liquidity is really bandwidth in these decentralized Web3 ecosystems, and Tokemak is there to enable users to, in a very easy manner, participate in that ecosystem, provide LPing in an automated fashion in a very simple manner, and also kind of optimize their yields.
Right, definitely. And one thing you mentioned is kind of starting with governance tokens, which, back in the day in DeFi was kind of everything. But I think we've seen a shift lately. I know you mentioned stables. I think RWA has grown a lot as well. So where do you kind of see the DeFi space right now, and how Tokemak, fits in with the way things work now versus maybe, in those yield maxing days?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the stablecoins are very hot right now, and I don't think that's going away anytime soon.
Definitely.
As more and more groups are launching stablecoins, it means that opportunities for sort of an automated LP experience that can kind of optimize yield and just really aggregate LPing is a very powerful concept. So we're seeing a ton of demand for our stablecoin-based product. When we first launched back in September of last year, the Autopilot platform, we had solution for the various ETH flavors, so LSTs, LRTs, et cetera. And while that had nice uptick, it was really when we launched kind of beginning of this year, the stablecoin-based vaults or Autopools, where we've really seen things taken off, and I think that's not going away. As you said, RWAs I think are finally here. I think for any of us that have been in crypto a long time, that's always sort of been, we've always heard that it's kind of time for that, but now I'm seeing a lot of things that actually mean it probably is time. And I think any of these that have various flavors in even the world between kind of stable coins into yield bearing stable coins, and then ultimately RWAs that might be tokenized money markets and treasuries and things, all of these I think is just a massive opportunity. Anytime you have near fungible assets, there's just a really big available solution set, I guess, to deploy LPing or aggregate LPing across.
Yeah, and we still see, huge spreads across asset classes that have very similar risk profiles. And all of these spreads and inefficiencies that can exist either across the same asset class or different chains are just a symptom of the fact that people are still manually providing liquidity. And we're really focused on changing that and just introducing automated liquidity provision.
Definitely. And when it comes to I think another thing besides tokens that has evolved is the DeFi user themselves. And I think, we're seeing a lot more institutional involvement So I guess from a customer or user perspective, what's your thesis on that? Who are you trying to capture?
Yeah, that's a great question. Manuel and I were actually just chatting about that a little bit ago. So, obviously, most DeFi products or platforms first cater to DeFi users, and I think you always need to kind of build concentric rings around those. So while we always want to build products for people that understand and use DeFi, it's really important to kind of go to the broader addressable markets that sit outside of that. So we're really going we're really going after that in two different ways. One is to find a way to get to a broader user base that might not be as DeFi native or DeFi savvy. So this even gets to, can we offer an Autopilot solution for someone that is not used to holding stablecoins on chain, and we're making significant strides there. And then on the other hand, it's how do you actually reach institutions, which I think you mentioned, Brendan. A lot of them now are not only getting into crypto, but they're also, even if they don't use the words DeFi and smart contract, they're really kind of going into these on-chain concepts and on-chain yields. And so I think having this be a kind of high yield savings account that can optimize or aggregate over multiple modalities of yield is a really compelling product, almost like a cash sweep opportunity for a lot of these desks, especially given that Autopilot, people can enter and exit instantly. So if they have idle stablecoins or cash, it's a great product for people to earn attractive yield.
Yeah, definitely. I think something that we're seeing now is kind of the fintech and crypto being symbiotic and just becoming one space, especially with things like Robinhood, what they're launching lately. It's pretty insane. But yeah, I guess from the user perspective, if you're using Autopool, I think you kind of covered it, Carson, but I guess end to end, what does that look like, and what are some of the benefits the Autopilot's solving?
You want to take that one, Manuel?
Yeah, for sure. I'll start just by mentioning kind of the problem statement that we identified for this. On Autopilot, there were issues that we previously identified for manual LPs, such as yield volatility, very large option set in terms of both DEX, LP positions, link markets, and so on. And overall, each time that you make a decision to enter or exit, for example, a pool, you're always incurring in switching costs in the form of gas, slippage, and trading fees. So what we decided was, well, let's just fully replace this manual decision-making process and let's automate it. And the system that we created to do so, it's Autopilot. Autopilot is basically an on-chain autonomous capital allocator, right? And the way that the system is structured and its architecture has essentially autopools at the center. And these autopools, they are ERC vaults, are going to point to different destinations, are destinations that are eligible for liquidity deployments. Across these different sets of autopools, you always have an on-chain strategy that is essentially going to dictate what are the constraints that must be met for a rebalance to occur. And then you have an off-chain component for the system, which is the solver, that is going to propose rebalances to this autopool contract. And then these rebalances, in order to be valid and occur, they need to meet these on-chain constraints that are associated with each strategy that is paired with every single autopool. You have a very complicated stat system that provides you all the required information to make those decisions.
Okay, very interesting. So I guess on the contract side, you mentioned the ERC model you're using. It definitely get complex, building a system like this. So I guess what are some unique design challenges maybe you faced, or problems, or, I guess unique difficulties with building, a complex system like this?
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of challenges. And in order to remain competitive, your edge really depends on integrations. How quickly can you integrate new protocols? How quickly can you roll out new autopools that are focused just on streamlining liquidity, for example, across a new chain, and so on. So this involves an approach to security that is very focused, for example, on fork testing new integrations, isolate those components, and make sure that the system as a whole still behaves as expected. And I would say that, when it comes to fast rollouts, this testing process and making sure that every single new integration is audited with one of our security partners is definitely highly ranked there as one of those obstacles.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess when it comes to risk modeling, what's kind of your thesis there? Because there's also the financial security side to a system like this.
Yeah, so there are two sides to this. So there is the portfolio management itself in terms of the curation of the integrated destinations into an auto pool. And there's a null framework on that side. And then there are the actual, security mechanisms that can be triggered to enter or exit some of these positions. On the actual mechanisms that we have in place, we have tools such as destination shutdowns, where we basically signal to the solver that this position has to be exited. And there are also components that are more associated with the strategy that start to trim positions once you start to see, for example, discounts that go above a predefined band. So in between the financial modeling and the actual tools that we have at our disposal, you need to have these sides of the actual risk frameworks and then the tools to execute those risk frameworks.
Right. Very interesting. Yeah, totally makes sense. I guess zooming out a little bit from there, when it comes to, gaining market share for a protocol like this, what do you think is most important to people? Like integrations, the overall performance is obviously important, and then, the UX as well.
So UX, we've really invested a lot on UX. Our front-end team, they did a long process for user research, and I'm very happy with the current state that we're in. They're always looking to improve, so you'll see some changes pretty soon. When it comes to new integrations and getting market share, what we've seen that works really well, it's partnering, for example, with chains or partnering with asset issuers and making sure that we provide a new value offering by streamlining liquidity exclusively to their own ecosystem. So I've mentioned previously the curation of Autopools, and we largely define two groups of Autopools. There are our Tokemak Autopools, which are curated by ourselves. There are ecosystem Autopools, where we partner with, for example, a specific chain or an asset issuer, like we've done recently with Inverse Finance, and we'll curate destinations that they wish to see included in order to just allow them to onboard their own users with a solution that not only provides them better returns, but it's just a much easier UX. One of the things that for me it's still a huge pain point is that each time that I'm participating in an airdrop farming campaign for a stablecoin, I need to pick between LPing on Pendle, providing liquidity to one of their money markets, or just participating in one of their endless LP positions. What we're focused as of now, and with the upcoming Pendle integration that we're going to have very soon, is to provide to asset issuers a value offering where if they include all of these different destinations into their single auto pool, they have a single entry point that also solves a lot of issues that they have, like, for example, migrating their Pendle LP markets to new maturities, which is always a period where they lose a lot of users. All of these things, I think that they really highlight that while thinking about this automated liquidity product, Autopilot, you have these two sides of the LP-focused side that is really trying to maximize these returns, but then Autopools become a more utilitarian tool when they're focused on the project side. And for that purpose, I think that streamlining liquidity while remaining composable, because as Carson said, we have a lot of design choices to make sure that users can always withdraw their liquidity at any given moment in time. So no waiting periods, no withdrawal queues or anything. And all of these decisions were very well thought in order to just maximize composability. And yeah, I think that covers it. Anything to add?
Yeah, just building on that a little bit, fully agree with everything that Manuel just said. I think like the adding new integrations and adding integrations quickly, as well as kind of the yield component, which you mentioned, Brendan, those two things obviously are related. As you get more integrations, you're able to unlock more yield sources and yield sources as they come online, which is very important. But I think for us, and probably for me at the moment, the most important thing really is the ease of use point that you brought up, or the UX. And as Manuel said, it's those two different groups. There's kind of that use Autopilot. There's the LP side, which is kind of the obvious side you'd first think of if you see or use Tokemak Autopilot. And that's very attractive right now. You can earn up to 10 to 11% right now at the moment on stablecoins within the system. But then you also have the asset, and LPs are looking to maximize their returns as you would expect, but they also are looking for a simple, easy to use platform. Asset issuer side, they really want to decrease their cost of liquidity, as Manuel said. So that's really interesting. And those kind of dovetail back into integrations, because when you find partnerships with those, that generally opens you up to a new user base. So you find a stablecoin issuer or a new chain or a new platform, and then you launch an auto pool dedicated to that ecosystem, and then you can get sort of joint distribution or joint marketing to their end users. I think keeping everything very easy to use, very composable with everything, which of course is a tenet of DeFi, is critical. And in my opinion, kind of hitting that UX or delivering Autopilot to people where and how they exist today is probably one of the most important things that we can do going forward, not only from a chain by chain basis, but also, as we mentioned earlier, how do you serve people that aren't using DeFi day to day today, how are you serving? How can you deliver Autopilot to a group that isn't using DeFi day to day today, which is a mouthful? Or how do you go to institutions by way of kind of a B2B2B model often, where we can partner with another platform that already has institutional capital and stablecoins in it, and then distribute there? That's going to be some of the ways that we really expand our TVL and market share next.
Yeah, 100%. And like back to the UX point, it seems like there's a lot of advantages to both sides. But I think what's really cool about this product is definitely maximizing composability. I think for me, that was like the most interesting thing about DeFi in the beginning. And sometimes it gets lost because, yeah, like you're saying, for the user, you shouldn't have to do all those things manually. You should be able to go to one place and have a strategy executed for you. That's kind of the benefit of having DeFi in the first place. But yeah, and it sounds like the yields are good too. So I guess what's kind of the process behind picking which protocols to integrate with and picking the best yield routes for the user?
Yeah, so I think that I can take that one. While defining, for example, new protocols to integrate or new autopools to set up, one of the key pieces of criteria is really the addressable market, right? And the way that we calculate this addressable market is by looking at the capacity that that autopool can serve. So how much AUM can it intake at a given target rate? In addition to that, we also take into account a lot of growth aspects. Our first L2 to be onboarded, it was Base. It was far before Base can add any kind of activity. This was 1 year before we even launched Autopilot. And it turns out that Base USD, for example, right now it's the best way to put your USD to work on Base. And we noticed that picking different chains also has a lot of implications in terms of the velocity of money on that specific chain. For instance, Base has a lot of active capital. It was very easy to bootstrap this product organically, even though our bootstrapping campaign had way less incentives than in some of our previous efforts. So looking also at the idiosyncrasies of different chains, understanding how capital itself behaves on that chain and what those users are looking for is also part of the user. And then it's a learning process of learning what works, what doesn't work, staying up to speed with DeFi, just seeing what are the new features that users demand. Like, for example, integrating now long duration options on some of our autopools. All of that is also taken into account.
Okay, and so you mentioned building on Base. What chains are you live on right now, and are there any more in the pipeline that are priority?
As of now, we are live on 3 chains. So Ethereum mainnet, Base, and Sonic. And we have plans, like maybe I'll turn it over to Manuel of whether we want to announce details or not, but we have plans, of course, to go to more chains quite quickly, I think. But Manuel, maybe I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, for sure. So again, high growth bet plays and then integrations based on capacity. The high growth chains are always a question mark, right? But I think that in between the most interesting ecosystems that I'm excited to try out, Plasma, given our focus on stablecoins, it's definitely one of them. And, having discussed with the Plasma team, I really like their approach. Instead of trying to incubate their own DeFi ecosystem, that comes with a lot of risks. Like if you want to incubate your own DeFi protocols, the risk of exploits, etc., just increases a lot. Plasma has a different approach. They're trying to onboard DeFi blue chips in terms of all the different DeFi primitives. And for us, that became an obvious choice of where to be present on their day one launch on mainnet. So that's definitely going to be one of our focuses, Plasma USD. Then I can also openly mention the other chains that I have on my spreadsheets with Autopool lists, and that's Hyperliquid, Monad, and obviously Arbitrum. Arbitrum was always going to happen. It's just a matter of prioritizing, again, entering a high growth chain versus something that is already very well established. And yeah, Arbitrum and Base, as of now, they're unrivaled when it comes to quality DeFi.
Yeah, totally. And one thing you mentioned a bit earlier, Manuel, was incentives. So I think you guys have a protocol token, Toki. So yeah, I would be curious to learn about, how it works, maybe what makes it unique, and, incentives that are happening with it.
Sure, I can kick off on that side. Toke, as you mentioned, our native governance token, it can be staked at tokemak.xyz. And what we're doing today is revenue sharing. So depending on how you lock or stake your token, right now you can earn up to 24% APR on that token. And that all comes from effectively revenues that are being generated within the platform, and then buybacks of the token that is then distributed. We're going to be doing more very soon to further kind of add utility as well as align incentives between toke holders in the platform. So we're going to enable the ability to sort of utilize toke votes in order to align where the net emissions or kind of the the bootstrapping potential of Autopilot goes. And what I mean by that is if you look at our pools today, most of the yield is actually generated natively in the pool. This isn't something like back in the day in DeFi where people are emitting crazy amounts of tokens in order to bootstrap pools. At the moment, when we're adding more and more chains quickly, that's still managed at the protocol level, but soon we'll be outsourcing that to the toke holders as well, so that they can kind of determine where we need a little extra juice in emissions and where we should attract more TVL. Manuel, anything to add to that?
I'll say that, we're at the early stage of bootstrapping this new product. We had a very long phase. We launched our initial MVP Autopools, which are our legacy Autopools focused on ETH-denominated assets. And a few months ago, we launched our new generation Autopools that now include all of the different stablecoins that we have integrated. And throughout this process, we've learned very well how to do the bootstrapping steps for different autopools. And it's always with minimal incentives, because at the end of the day, Autopilot can work without any incentives. That's the beauty of it. So tokens should catalyze growth. They should not be necessary for growth to occur. And it's interesting that when we plot, for example, our NAV on our oldest autopools, like for example, AutoETH, you see an exponential curve at the start due to the rewarder in terms of the net emissions. And then as we unwind those incentives, you will see a plateau and then organic growth. And this is what a very successful bootstrapping looks like. Now, mimicking that kind of success for different stablecoin pools, like for example, AutoUSD, which has around $20 million, and Base USD, which also has around $20 million. What we've seen, it was a very similar behavior of users entering during that exponential phase, but then the retention is very solid because the real yield that comes from the base rates, it's also there. And this might be a small nuance, but I think that it's a very interesting part of the system that most users might not immediately understand. It's not intuitive because I get this question a lot of times. And what I mean here is that once you turn a new auto pool online, you have a high yield from the rewarder, right? And some of these initial inflows, they go to a deployment queue, and they are deployed by the solver proposing rebalances to the auto pool, as I mentioned, and allocating those funds. Now, these deployments, they don't always happen to the highest yielding destination, because Autopilot also takes into account the deployment costs. So you will see often that the first deployments look at first glance suboptimal because they're picking no slippage or low slippage routes to, for example, markets. But then over time, once this initial high influx of TVL is done, what you actually see is that the rebalances then happen from these low slippage routes to the higher yielding destinations, but in smaller tranches so that you don't take such a big hit in NAV per share. What this implies from a bootstrapping perspective is that as the incentives are unwind, the base rate is actually increasing over time. So it actually compensates that decrease. And this is how we like to do our organic bootstrapping processes.
Yeah, that's great to hear about organic growth. I think, anyone can incentivize a pool, but what matters is that the liquidity stays around and ideally grows, after those end. But also getting that in front of people can be a challenge too, because there's a lot of, protocols out there. So I guess what are your thoughts or approach or thesis on go-to-market and, letting users know what's available?
Yeah, I might just add one thing to the previous one and then jump to the answer to that question. So I think what Manuel mentioned brings up a really interesting kind of trade-off that the auto pools trade-off and decision tree that the auto pools make kind of through the space. So as you know, they're selecting through a large solution set of destinations to deploy, but they're also looking at the volatility of yield and then the slippage or switching costs of jumping into those destinations. The yield volatility is an important point to note, because what the auto pools do not see a higher yield someplace and then just jump over there, because obviously it costs something to rebalance the portfolio and jump over and provide liquidity someplace else. So they'll actually look at volatility of the yield historically and say, hey, if I take the hit and have the slippage and other trading fees loss of jumping over to a pool, how quickly will I be paid back based on, do I anticipate this as a blip in the yield? And what is my sort of payback period for going over there? So it's actually a very intelligent algorithm that is managing the LP aggregation here. And I think that's worth mentioning because, kind of to Manuel's point about how the yields can actually improve over time, not only with the amassing of more TVL when you go to a new chain or new destination, There's also often the case that a new chain will launch and they won't have, they don't have the massive list of potential destinations that we can integrate with that, say, Ethereum mainnet does. You have this interesting kind of mode of a liquidity movement where at first there might be very high incentives, but there's only a few places to deploy. And then new things come online on the chain, and then it becomes Autopilot really starts to shine because it's able to more directly optimize over the solution set and kind of move to a state where someone just manually managing this couldn't keep track of everything.
Those are good points. When it comes to the long-term sustainability, and obviously you've optimized the protocol for this, how do you communicate that to the user?
That is a great question. I think one of the ways, and we kind of did this even as we first launched the ETH-based version of the platform late last year, is you kind of have to, before we launched, we had to rely on back testing. So you had to show people, you had to kind of show this concept of yields are all over the place and the actual detrimental effects of chasing yield. So if you just go after wherever the highest yield is, you eat away your principal by always taking the trading fees and slipping.
Game theory there.
Yep, exactly. So I think that's part of it. The short answer, by the way, is we're always looking for better ways to show this because it is a very complex system, and to the user it's incredibly simple. But in order to show them why this is better than why it's different than anything else that's out there in yield, even though it leverages as building blocks all these underlying components, I think showing individuals that, hey, you can pick any individual destination for yield or even any single modality, but why not go into a Tokemak Autopilot Autopool that is optimizing over all of these things. So we didn't get into this a lot, but this optimizes not, if you take stablecoins, for example, it's looking not only at LPing and the trading fees and incentives you can make there, but it's also looking at, say, the basis trade via Athena. It's looking at money markets. It's looking at treasury yields and various DAO governance enabled or driven sources of yield for capital. So it's optimizing over all those things. So you can pick an individual source or an individual destination if you're a user, and you might perform at the same level of an auto pool or maybe even outperform in a very short period. But then as soon as the yield, the state of yield across DeFi and really across the economy changes, you're going to start losing, and then you're going to be chasing it with the slippage. Whereas when we probably should mention this too, when capital is sort of aggregated at the level, like right now, there's around $85 million in TVL and growing within Tokemak. And so when you have larger amounts, that minimal amount of slippage becomes smaller and smaller for a large pool of capital when you're rebalancing versus an individual, say, retail user who's trying to chase these things, and the fees and slippage are really eating away all the principal in a much more aggressive way.
Yeah. Absolutely. And getting back to my other question then, I think on the framing side makes sense, but for getting the word out and kind of the go-to-market for you guys, what's your perspective on that? What are some things that you're doing and that you've tried?
So I think and I'll throw it over to Manuel too, but I think when we launch with a new partner, whether it's a platform on an existing chain that we're on or a new chain or a different asset issuer, it's all about engaging directly with their community and their ecosystem. Definitely. So these are groups that not only already bought into a different ecosystem, they probably don't know about Tokemak Autopilot, so we have to go there, and whether that's sort of jumping into Discords or jumping on podcasts and things like that with them, Ask Me Anything, et cetera, trying to engage those communities. And then I think more broadly, a lot of my time right now is spent talking to institutions to try to get that user base into Tokemak, and that also is often by where can we find where the institutions hold their capital of the day, whether that's custodians or staking providers, et cetera, where we can build an integration there. And then last, the one that we're currently working a lot on is how do we kind of go out to these user bases that aren't DeFi native at the moment, and we've got more work to do on that. Manuel, anything on your side to add?
Yeah, definitely. Like you've already touched on a really important point, which is co-marketing is definitely the most important tool when you're targeting a DeFi native crowd. A lot of people ask, for growth hacks, etc. It's really co-marketing. You're just entering a cross-section of communities and you're engaging with new LPs, and we've found that to be, super helpful for our front. But then in addition to that, like Carson was mentioning, we're also exploring new ways to onboard different types of users. One of those ways, it's a secondary project. Let's call it making Autopilot more fintech-like, where we're trying to fully abstract the word crypto and let people directly on board with wire transfers and so on. And I do think that within a very recent future, if you're not trying to capture users with these different distribution funnels that are more focused on this fintech kind of reality that just uses DeFi on the back end, you're going to be missing out on the largest part of the market share that we should expect in the future. So make a very simple USD-based savings account, allow users to realize part of that interest so that this feels tangible. Because to a lot of people, crypto is still seen as this black box that is magic internet money. So realizing that promise and making DeFi tangible, it's also definitely part of our user focus for the next few months.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a massive opportunity, and it's been a long time coming of, DeFi and fintech kind of becoming one, especially on the stablecoin side. There's just, as we've talked about, just so much you can do there, more than just a simple, savings account or something. I guess when it comes to onboarding institutions, you mentioned, Carson, what's the framing there? What are they? Because I think a DeFi degen, you can tell them we have 10,000% APY, and they're good with it. They don't even blink. But I'm sure institutions, the framing is probably quite different there. So what have you kind of seen on your side of where they're at when it comes to looking at the crypto space?
Yeah. So I think stablecoins are ultimately, so for example, I was at a Goldman Sachs conference last week in London, and I think the stablecoins were definitely the talk of the conference more so than Bitcoin. Interestingly, Ethereum did come up, and there was some pushes for ETH even at a Bitcoin-based panel. But I would say stablecoins were far and away the most talked about thing. I think that's what's really onboarding institutions into this space. Even DeFi came up, not always called DeFi, but really this on-chain finance concept, kind of as you said, Brendan, when the line of fintech and DeFi sort of gets blurred, and I think that's by way of stablecoins. That's kind of where they're entering. So I think the biggest open question for them, I think you have obviously traditional finance players. There's a huge spectrum of those, and the banks are at a very different spot than a principal hedge fund or something like that that's already holding some crypto assets. But really, it depends on whether they can wrap their head around smart contract risk, not specifically to Tokemak Autopilot, but just broadly within DeFi. And as soon as they can get their handle on how they can sort of risk rate that, there's just a massive opportunity. Some of the groups are already going into that. Some of them are further back, and it's hard for them to think beyond counterparty risk and more of the risks that are available and plentiful in traditional finance. But in my opinion, that's sort of the final gate that's waiting to be lifted, is just getting them comfortable with how smart contracts work and smart contract risks, and how smart contract risk works, because they love the concept. They're sort of fully bought in. I'm talking broadly now, but fully brought into the stablecoin based world. I think they see that the 24/7 nature, this is another thing that came up a lot, is the 24/7 nature of crypto assets and stablecoins. And they even talked about bringing in intraday yield and those kind of things. So there's still a few steps back, but even, something like Tokemak Autopilot, where you can enter it in real time, in and out, and block by block, or basically in a real time basis, generate this yield. That's really compelling to them. And so it's really just getting comfortable with smart contract, which all of this is built on.
Yeah, 100%. That makes a ton of sense. So I think right now, stablecoins definitely, like you said, huge focus on the institutional side. And I think USDC is kind of the driving coin on the stable side. But I've seen things like, JP Morgan working on, their own stable in the background. So I guess what's your guys' perspective on stables as an asset? Will it be one main leader, or do you think we'll see a lot of different, entities owning their own, version of a stable?
I personally think there's going to be quite a few, at least for the foreseeable future. And I think you can even see that if you look at the large market cap players today, where I think if you rewound probably to the previous administration, there's a lot of reasons you would have thought, well, maybe Circle wins the day. But I think now in the current administration, you have Circle's IPO'd, and then also with current administration, Tether has very solid tendrils in. So I think you have both of those have sort of been enshrined in a way in the space. But I think you're going to have a lot broader choices out there for consumers as well. You'll have some that are proper stable coins following, the guidance of Genius Act, et cetera. And then I think you'll have these other things that are maybe not technically stable coins by way of what in the US anyway they're calling them, but still some interesting opportunities. And for us, we really want to be, these savings account, or the accounts or kind of yield accounts that can operable with a lot of these different stable coins. So for us, I think that's helpful. Well, what do you think for the multi-stablecoin future?
Well, I'll say that in the two different categories of either payment stablecoins, which is the focus of USDC, USDT, etc., and yield-bearing stablecoins, we're still just in the cusp of the explosion on the yield-bearing stablecoin side. We have yet to agree as an industry on the correct nomenclature, but looking at the current percentage, I think that it's around 4% or so of the total stablecoin supply in yield-bearing stables. I see a lot of parallels with money market funds in the 70s that grew to $1 trillion industry, So if there is something that I'm very, very bullish on, it's the increasing nature of new yield sources coming into the space and just more and more competition on the yield-bearing stablecoin side. And I think that by now, each single yield-bearing stablecoin asset issuer already understood that there is no single yield source that can scale to global demand. You see that with the basis trade, like they have to start also entering, coordinations with Maker to be able to sustain periods when fund went down. And I think that this poses an interesting question for us at Autopilot, which is we're not opinionated on a single yield source,
Right.
just aggregating all of them. So you don't rely on different market cycles. You're just acknowledging that the market for yield on dollars is always going to see volatility, and we're just automating your liquidity in order to capture those cycles. So yeah, very excited about that part of the explosion.
Definitely. And yeah, I totally agree that the yield-bearing stable is going to grow, and it's kind of untapped right now. I mean, obviously, we had a huge market correction at one point with Luna. But that being said, I don't think we need to throw out the entire concept. I guess just curious, Manuel, where do you think there's opportunities like to build something like that? What do you think the right way to build something like that would be, and where the yield would come from?
You mean specifically new forms of yield-bearing stables?
Yes.
Well, I think that there is still a lot of alpha to capture in having something more similar to structured finance. Something that brings on-chain RWAs that are not just boring USTs, but you also start to see, corporate debt, you start to see munis, you start to see interval funds coming on-chain. And I do think that soon enough, we'll see the tools just have structured books like you'd have, for example, in a normal bank or structured product. So yeah, I think that we're still in the very early innings, not on the on-chain yield sources. That part, I think that it's already pretty mature, but we're in the very early innings of seeing RWAs being integrated into yield-bearing stablecoins. And if there's one thing to be very excited about, it's that side of on-chain finance and tokenization. And I'm glad that we're now accepting not to call this DeFi, but rather on-chain finance.
Totally agree. Yeah, I think that the RWA and stables can definitely work hand in hand and provide like more sustainable yield. But yeah, I guess, so getting back to Tokemak, overall, what do you guys think is the number one challenge or limiter to growth to get to the, another 10x level from where you're at right now?
I'll start. I think the biggest thing that can expand our addressable market is really just getting outside of DeFi, or really going into, as Manuel, I think, was just saying, kind of on-chain finance. So how do you tap into that much broader market? And you always need to first be able to engage the hardcore, the most savvy DeFi users. And so up to date with Autopilot, that's who we've engaged. And now our next big phase here of this is to make sure that we can engage institutions and then a broader user base that isn't crypto savvy. I think that's the biggest growth opportunity, in addition to being able to move really fast with integrations and kind of go to new ecosystems for probably the more hardcore as they advance. That's how we make sure we stay relevant within the DeFi community as new chains and new platforms roll out.
Carson touched on a point that is super important to me, and I see a lot of Web 2 approaches that fail because they forget about prioritizing DeFi users. DeFi users are still the first ones to show up and bootstrap. And internally, we have a goal that I hope that we're going to achieve very, very soon of crossing the $100 million mark. But you need to show that your product has traction. You need to show that there was meaningful organic adoption without fancy points campaigns or new tokens. We've already demonstrated that, in my opinion. And this was only possible due to a very DeFi native crowd, where we know that there's still a lot of growth to expect. But as Carson said, like if you're looking for multipliers in growth, the way to go is definitely expanding beyond it. Really speaking, if I'm trying to onboard my grandparents or my parents, I would never advise them, to have their own hardware wallets and interact with DeFi. It's a minefield, right? So there's a lot of improvements that we need to have on that front. And we're working on that, on providing easier ways for people to access on-chain capital and yield products.
Definitely. So yeah, capture the existing DeFi user and then expand the pie beyond there, which is great because I think in DeFi, rising tide definitely lifts all ships. Any movement to bring liquidity on chain is good for all of us. So in terms of your team, what's kind of the structure like right now? And are you hiring for any roles looking to expand it at all?
I was just going to mention that we've just hired a new engineer, front-end dev, for this effort that I was mentioning in a not too clear way. But Carson, feel free to touch on the rest.
Yeah, and I would say just generally, we're a very flat organization. We try to be able to move very quickly, be very agile. In some level, we're always hiring, and that we always want to talk to the best and brightest in the space. And I think at the moment is an interesting moment, I think, for hiring, because I think those internal to the space see a lot of opportunities out there. But then also you have this big group of sort of outsiders that I think for the last 24 months or so haven't been interested in coming in the space, and now all of a sudden they're very interested again. So definitely. I think it's an interesting moment right now for hiring, and yeah, we always want to talk to good people.
Awesome. And yeah, so earlier you mentioned toke holders. They have the ability to get involved and kind of make some protocol level decisions. So if anyone's interested in doing that, where should they go to get involved and be a part of the community?
Mm-hmm. So they should definitely join our Discord, but then in terms of actually using the token, they can go to tokemak.xyz, and then they can go to the stake toke stoke tab, and there that's where they can stake their token and earn protocol revenue. At the moment, I mentioned, I think at this date and time, it's at about 24% APR that they can learn, all from toke buybacks from the actual protocol revenue. And then in the near future, we're going to be turning on more functionality for that, where they'll also be able to help determine where emissions go, and also some other interesting things that we're yet to announce. But the easiest way is if they have toke, just come to the Tokemak website, stake, and then jump into our Discord, and of course follow us on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, all right, guys, I think we covered a lot. Was there anything else that you wanted to get to?
No, this was pretty good. I will just mention that as kind of a final remark. When you think about Autopilot, what we're really trying to do is introduce LP aggregation. This early thesis was 1 inch for traders, Autopilot for liquidity providers. You need something somewhat analogous that allows you to be able to aggregate liquidity across multiple different sources. And I think that one metric to watch out for is the volume in automated liquidity that Autopilot is creating. So there's already, a lot of bots trading on chain, that's for sure. But in terms of actual capital allocation for liquidity provision, just with Ethereum focused autopools that have a much lower frequency, Autopilot has already done almost $500 million in volume. And this is with the really low frequency type of pools. So I'm very excited to just see this metric grow over time, because it just shows that more and more autonomous on-chain capital allocators are stepping in. And overall, markets are just becoming more efficient, which is better for us as users, protocols, and the industry as a whole.
Awesome. Yeah, that's huge. I mean, I'm a huge fan of what you guys are building. I'm bullish, and definitely wish you guys the best, and congrats on all the growth so far. And yeah, thanks for hopping on the pod.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Brendan. I might say one last thing, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it, Carson.
So the other thing I'd like to say to everyone is, if they have any stable coins and they're looking for yield, go to tokemak.xyz. I just pulled it up, and right now the APY is between 9 and 18%, depending on whether your stable coins are on Ethereum mainnet or Base or Sonic. So explore that. I think you'll enjoy the experience.
And a lot of new launches coming soon on a lot of new chains.
Awesome.
Yes, lots to come.